Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines magazine podcast. I'm Faisal Al Yafai, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events and personalities from around the world. When Katja Hoyer started writing Beyond the Wall, her history of post-war East Germany published last year, she identified right at the beginning the character that had come to dominate the period after German reunification, Angela Merkel. Hoyer's book documents the violent years following the Second World War, right up until the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the reunification that thrust Merkel, an East German-born daughter of a pastor, into the political limelight. Well reviewed in the UK, it sparked a conversation in Germany about the relationship between East and West. Merkel herself, who held the chancellorship from 2005 until 2021, was the poster child for how a woman born and raised in East Germany could rise to the top of a state dominated in many ways by the political legacy of the West. But Hoyer noticed Merkel's reluctance to mention her East German background and was curious about all that was left unsaid, why such a powerful figure was seemingly unable to be truly candid about her past, and what that suggested about the country Merkel ran for the best part of 2 decades. Now, Angela Merkel has published a memoir titled Freedom. Her publishers promised an intimate glimpse into the former Chancellor's own personal history. But on reading it, Hoyer still isn't sure that Merkel has truly learned to open up. Perhaps that makes sense. Hoyer notes in the book that the relationship between the West and the East might be very difficult for non-Germans to understand, marked as it is by a certain dismissiveness on the part of some West Germans for their East German counterparts. In the book, Hoyer, who was herself born in East Germany, writes how much of the West is struggling to see even why anyone would choose to remember their lives behind the Iron Curtain. In the Western imagination, East Germans wasted 41 years in a walled-off Russian colony. What is there worth remembering? Hoyer joins us on The Lead to discuss Merkel's memoirs, her own history of East Germany, and why the region is such an important bellwether in a country in political flux. Katja Hoyer, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Your book, Beyond the Wall, opens right at the beginning with an anecdote from October of 2021. That was the final Reunification Day speech in this long political career of Angela Merkel. And reunification, Merkel said at the time, was an event that most Germans have experienced, quote, consciously, and that has changed our lives. And you write in the book that actually her career is a kind of testament to the many successes of reunification. But you also say that this background of hers, her East German background, was a political asset in a country that wanted to show itself that it was now a united nation, but that it was only a political asset as long as it remained in the background. And I'm wondering, now that you've seen her recently released autobiography, do you think that has corrected the imbalance, or do you think that still is the case?
Well, it's interesting that Angela Merkel now says that it's a huge part of her life. You know, this first half, literally, of her life, 35 years, she's 70 now, that she lived in the GDR in East Germany, and is willing to talk about it in much more detail than she was before. During her 16 years as Chancellor, she barely spoke about it at all. But it was often mentioned when people criticised, you know, the way that reunification went, any disadvantages that came out of it for East Germans. There was very high unemployment, for example, in the early 2000s, when a fifth of East Germans didn't have work and those sorts of things. And she was often held up as an example to say, you know, you can make it. It's just a matter of your own willingness and ambition to do so. And there's nothing standing in your way. And I think that's been reevaluated a little bit in more recent times, including by Angela Merkel herself in that speech that you referenced on the Day of Unity in 2021, when it sort of burst out of her for the first time, really, that she felt she was belittled or looked down upon for being East German. And that's a theme that also comes out in her autobiography again.
Do you think, we'll talk about Merkel, but do you think that it's something that applies across Germany? Like when Merkel talks about feeling that even her as the Chancellor was looked down upon, do you think that that is something that other East Germans feel?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when my book was released in the German translation last year, and some other books came out at the same time about either East Germany before unification, as in the GDR, the state, or afterwards, after 1990, they all kind of were put together and discussed as a sort of new East-West debate within Germany. Right. And as a result of that, you saw a lot of sort of anger, frustration, but also people's personal anecdotes coming out. And all the talks I did as a result of that debate last year in Germany, you got a lot of people saying, you know, I hadn't thought about these things for years. They just sort of pent up in me as anger or frustration, but I never really sort of talked about it. And now it was kind of like this cathartic, I would say, release of this tension that came out last year, and also showed in the political landscape where East Germans are much more willing to go to the far left or to the far right than is the case in the former West Germany. So I think there's a lot still in the air as far as German unity is concerned.
This is partly the reason that you set out to write this book, because you felt that the identity of East Germany and East Germans had been obscured and not properly represented?
Yes, I mean, it's not an activist book in the sense that I'm writing as a sort of angry, you know, East German trying to claim an identity for me and the other sort of millions of people who were born in the GDR. I think it was more, for me as a historian, it was more important to actually place the GDR in context of German history, make it a proper chapter of German history. Because for a long time it's often been used either as a sort of bad example to show, you know, how much better things were in the Federal Republic in West Germany. Certainly during the Cold War that was the case. Or it was belittled, looked down upon. People would say, oh, you know, look at all the things you didn't have. You'd hear people say, oh, are you glad that you finally got like bananas and tinned pineapple now, because they were difficult to get hold of in the GDR. Those sorts of cliches and stereotypes basically were still around. So what I was trying to do basically is take the state seriously, put it into its historical context, look at how it even evolved in the first place, where it came from as a product of the Second World War, and then look at the experiences of the people that lived in that state, interviewing many of them as well, and just taking them seriously and placing them into context. So that was my approach to this, and at the same time other books came out in Germany that dealt with the experiences of East Germans after 1990 as well, and it was kind of seen as a collective debate about the East, really, and how it fits into German history and German politics.
Do you think that it's reasonable to describe it as a prejudice, that West Germans have this kind of prejudice against East Germans? I mean, you talked about, you for the readers, for the listeners rather, who don't know, you were born in the GDR, but I mean, you were a child when the GDR collapsed. So you have some memory of it, but I mean, most of your life was brought up in the reunified Germany. And yet you still say that there were these examples of people, I imagine, saying it to you, oh, aren't you pleased that you're part of reunification and you can get bananas and so on?
Yeah, I mean, those cliches don't really just affect people who actually lived in the GDR. You hear that today still. There's a big scandal last year where the head of the Springer concern, so this is the largest German media company, they run basically all the sort of big major newspapers in Germany, like the Bild-Zeitung, which is the most popular newspaper in Europe, and the head of that media conglomerate, messages were leaked from him where he said, well, East Germans can't help themselves, they're either communists or fascists, and he finds that disgusting. That if somebody who's in charge of papers and kind of other media thinks that, it just sort of trickles down, and it affects people who are even younger than me and were born after 1990, much the same way that it affects older people, because it never really goes away, the stereotyping. If you have articles about East Germans, you know, there's always the types of pictures that they use, the types of places that the media go to. People are often depicted as sort of a bit backward, a bit lazy, not really quite arrived, is often the phrase that they use, arrived in the sort of modern Germany. It's often used to explain why people vote for far right or far left parties, to sort of say people just don't get democracy. So all of that is still around, and it affects you if you're 15 as much as it does if you're sort of 50 or 60.
What do you think it is about that period of time, about East Germany and East Germans, that debate is still happening? There's this, I mean, is there, for example, an identity in East Germany? Would you say there is a kind of East German identity still, or has that gone away?
No, there is. So if you ask people explicitly whether they define themselves as Germans or East Germans or West Germans, far fewer West Germans say that they feel West German, they feel German. Whilst in the East, the number of people who feel explicitly East German is much higher. I mean, I've been asked this question a lot since I, published that book, and to be honest, I didn't really think about it in those terms for a long time because I've lived in the UK for so long, where I'm treated as basically a German. So that's not something that people will pick up on. So I kind of wasn't really there when all of this escalated and people became more entrenched. But I think what a lot of East Germans have done now is, the same thing that other minorities do, and they are not minority, they're only sort of 18% or so of the population, and they've taken on this identity, this negative identity that is ascribed to them, and turned it around, into like a defiant kind of fine, we are East Germans then. And this happens, you see this with other minorities a lot, basically, where you then make this an identity that's like a shield basically around you and the other people in that community to say that you've got something in common after all. So now you have football crowds, for example, in Leipzig shouting Ost, Ost, Ostdeutschland, so East, East, East Germany, to cheer their football team on and things like that. And there are many people in that crowd that are much, much younger than me and have basically not lived in the GDR.
You wrote something about this in the book where you write that, as a quote, much of the West is struggling to, this is West Germany, is struggling to see why anyone would choose to remember their lives behind the Iron Curtain. In the Western imagination, East Germans wasted is your term, 41 years in a walled-off Russian colony. What is there worth remembering? What do you think there is to remember that's so important and that you put into the book?
Well, I think it's, whatever experiences people have had, whether they were positive, negative, in most cases a combination of the two, they are part of people's lives. And that is the same point that Angela Merkel made, basically, in that speech in 2021. She was saying, you're talking about 35 years of my life, and you're just, throwing them away as if it was rubbish, or I should just forget about it, or recontextualize it, or whatever, with all the experiences that one had in that time. And I think if you do that on a national basis, basically you're doing this to an entire country that doesn't exist anymore, a people, basically, then there's something collective about that as well, basically. People feel undermined in their own past. So if you can't say, as Angela Merkel gives an example of that, she basically, for instance, said to the media in the 1990s that she had to write a political essay as part of her science studies at university, and that was normal. Everyone had to do this. You had to pretend that you were into the ideology and write this political essay. And she mentioned this and said that she got a bad grade in it, thinking, the West German journalists would be pleased with that. And instead they all went off and tried to find the thing, so that they could quote things from her where she said things about Marxism or whatever, because you had to pay lip service to it. And to be
honest, you're surprised that such a politician like Merkel didn't see that coming.
Yeah, but this was in the early 90s, and
young,
many other people were naive about this. They thought we lived these lives, why should we be ashamed about it? And that was, and then she said in an interview about this recently that from then on she kind of had, a sort of censor in her head, really, that told her, big alarm bells basically went off in her head every time she thought about speaking of her life in the East. And that means you're self-censoring. And if she does this at the top of German politics, you can only imagine what this does to people sort of lower down the chain, where people work in, say a West German company or whatever. Would you really start talking about your life before 1990 if all your colleagues are just going to roll their eyes and think that you've just said something ridiculous or misinterpret it? And so people stopped talking about it and suppressed all of that. But this does mean that everything that you did before 1990 is basically completely devalued and not a valid part of your life and not a valid part of German history. And I think that's led to a lot of resentment and frustration over the years.
It's a super interesting conversation because it's something I think that is just completely unknown outside of Germany. To be honest, I think most people have kind of absorbed the same mindset that, let's say, the West Germans have, which is that Germany, quote unquote, which is West Germany, perceived to be West Germany, absorbed their Eastern family, and that was the end of the story. And now we just have modern Germany. But you're saying that actually there's this huge part of the story of the 20th century of Germany that has just not been told to Germans themselves.
Yeah, and I think that is exactly the issue. If you take, and Germany is unique in that because it had these two parts. You know, if you think about Poland, for example, Poland is very well able as a nation to say that there's a before and an after. And they sort of see this as a story of national liberation, basically, when they got rid of communism and they all emerged from it, and they can talk as a nation about this and make sense of their own past. But nobody would say to anyone else in Poland, the life that you led, you know, in the 1980s or in the 1970s was all wrong, and we were doing it right. You know, there isn't this moralizing because everyone went through the same experience. And I think the issue that you have when you grow up in East Germany, and this is something I think that other people don't really think about, is that you're being judged on what you did. And the idea is, you know, if you weren't a dissident or an opponent, you were kind of playing along with the regime, and that makes you a part of that dictatorship. And there's always that accusation that you could have or should have done something, while nobody in Western societies on a day-to-day basis is held responsible for the politics that's happening at the top, or why they didn't do anything about it. It's just like me saying to you, did you walk past the homeless person today? Why didn't you do anything about them being homeless? And it's that sort of constant accusation that is, I think, unique to the German situation in particular, where, you know, East Germans are basically held responsible for everything that happened in that state if they didn't try to do anything about it, but kind of lived their normal lives in it.
One of the lines from a review of your book was something along that line, that they said that nobody was blameless in a dictatorship. And I thought, isn't that precisely the point of the dictatorship? Like, it's one thing to claim that the population is not blameless in a democracy because they all voted. But surely in a dictatorship, you can't hold people accountable for it because they don't have the right to change their leaders.
Yeah, and the idea is obviously that they should go on the streets or demonstrate or leave the country illegally in the case of the GDR, because obviously you weren't allowed to do that after the Berlin Wall was up. And the accusation is there then that if you stayed in that state and went to work and kind of lived your life without challenging the state, that kind of makes the dictatorship work and function. So for a long time you had this idea that the East German society consisted of perpetrators and victims, and you had to basically fit into one or the other category. If you weren't one, you were the other. And I think we're getting to a point now where that's being seen in a more nuanced way, and where that's broken up and moving away from that black and white image that people have. But it's taking some time because it is such a small group of people that we're talking about.
I mean, that dichotomy of being either a perpetrator or a victim, you can see why that dichotomy of the perpetrators and the victims would apply to someone like Merkel, who was 35 when the GDR fell. She had quite a good career there. So if you were applying that dichotomy to her, she would be a perpetrator, not a victim. And that would be a very hard sell for a Western German audience.
Yeah, and she's often been criticised for that by, former dissidents who got a very prominent role after 1990 in shaping the way that GDR history was written and how it was portrayed in documentaries and museums and so on, and they did accuse her of sort of not doing anything about it, because the other side of that is that Angela Merkel had to obviously sell herself, in a way to the West German establishment in a way that made her acceptable as a politician. So she couldn't, for instance, if you had any sort of Stasi past, that was a huge thing in the early 90s, that people's files were being opened. And you may have been a politician one day and then somebody finds out that you grassed up on your colleague in 1968 to the Stasi, and you were gone, basically. So she had to make a point to the West German establishment to say that she did live her life in the GDR, but she was also a pastor's daughter growing up in a very sort of religious environment, which was unusual, and therefore was able to sort of say, well, I lived in this sheltered world where I was able to carve out my niche in my life without being tarnished by the experience in any shape or form. So she tried to strike a middle path there, but that in itself meant that, you couldn't really talk about, I don't know, getting married or going on holiday or whatever, because people would sit there and say you were doing that while somebody else was sitting in prison or getting shot at the Berlin Wall. Right. So that's the eternal dichotomy, basically, if you talk about the GDR, that always comes up.
And this is one of the things you pull out in your book, that you talk to people who had experienced life in the GDR, and as you say, they did normal human things. They went on holiday, they got married, they lived lives. And there are, I think it comes through in the book, that there are positive aspects of that period of time. And even just trying to say it seems like you are falling into the category of being nostalgic for that period.
Yeah, and that's tricky because you're saying these things whilst at the same time, really bad stuff happened as well. So take my chapter on the 1960s. This is the period where the Berlin Wall is built and where some of the most horrific murders happened of people that were trying to flee it, where people were shot dead for trying to live a different life and go somewhere else. And at the same time, I was talking to, older people who were around at the time, and they're telling me this is when they got their first car, or when their first flat was being built, and when they could live somewhere decent, the first time they'd experienced stability and some form of economic recovery. So what do I do with that as a historian? I can't really ignore these people and say, no, this is all wrong, because whilst you were moving into your first flat and buying your first car, somebody else was trying to flee and shot dead. So what I did in the end was put both of the stories in the book and leave them standing side by side without much commentary on sort of, rights and wrongs and the moral ins and outs of it. And that was something that really rankled with a lot of German commentators in particular, that I basically didn't dismiss the sort of more positive side or the more positive things that people were telling me or that I was researching. Just because there was this other stuff happening at the same time, I kind of tried to put all of that in the book and leave the contrast and the conflicts that opens up standing.
And this was some of the criticism that came from Germans in particular about your book, that you were engaging in what they call in Germany Ostalgie, which is an Eastern nostalgia, like a yearning for an East German past that no longer exists. Explain that part, because I think that's a very uniquely German idea. It's not something that is easily translatable outside of the country.
No, it isn't. I found that really bizarre, to be honest. I mean, the book has come out now in 16 languages, and very few people outside of Germany would accuse me of that. And even within Germany, the book was a bestseller for months and read very widely by people. And a small group of basically GDR historians found it, to be too positive, basically, about the East. And accused me of nostalgia or nostalgie. I think there's always an intrinsic fear that if you start talking about some of the stuff that was positive about the GDR, I would say childcare is a classic example, which was basically really comprehensive and good and cheap and available to all women, which meant that they could go and work and have their children being looked after by kindergartens, nurseries. And that is something that I describe in it. And instantly, the moment you say that, you're being accused of being nostalgic because it's an aspect of the GDR that may appear positive. And that creates fears, almost as if the GDR was still there, almost as if it was still the competition in the Cold War. That you pick up this one positive thing and somehow this will make people want the GDR back, and I think that's complete nonsense. I mean, there was a survey, for instance, that people took in 2019, so 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, where they asked Germans, were there any positive aspects to the GDR? And over the majority, both in East and West Germany, more in the East, but also in the West, the majority of Germans said that, yes, there were some positive aspects of the GDR. And then the next question was, do you want the GDR back? And then suddenly you get 10% in the East saying yes and 2% or something in the West saying yes. It's a tiny minority, so people are very well able to say, yes, there were aspects like childcare, like social mobility and other things about the GDR that worked in their own context with all the drawbacks that came with that. But at the same time, it doesn't mean you want the propaganda, the dictatorship, the wall and all of that stuff back. You don't want anything back, you just want to discuss things that happened in the past. And I think distinguishing that is really important, but it's very difficult to do if you're a historian and you're also a former dissident, which a lot of GDR historians are in Germany, because you kind of just hate that state still so much that you can't step back from it and say, let people discuss it in all its facets. It's something that really grates on people for whom this history isn't history, it's very personal, it's their own background.
I mean, nostalgia is a very German concept, but the idea of people looking to the past and then saying, well, there were parts of it that were good, and being attacked for that isn't unique to Germany. We interviewed the Albanian professor Lede, who's now a colleague of yours, also in London academia, and she wrote a book about her upbringing in communist Albania. And just like you, she was trying to tell this full and rounded story about a particular period of time, and was attacked for saying, oh, you're saying there was something positive in communist Albania. Why do you think there is this fear, generally, of looking at these periods of time that have now fully passed into history and not being able to take them in their full, I think you used this phrase, full colour and context?
Yeah, I found really interesting how Lea Ypi's book was, she kind of had a similar, as you say, similar situation in that it was very positively reviewed in the UK. And then in Albania itself, it was also seen very critically by people accusing her of nostalgia. In contrast to me, she actually openly says that she's a Marxist, and has got very sort of specific views on, you know, the way that the faults of capitalism. She's very intellectual, philosophical figure, really, who thinks deeply about this sort of stuff. Whilst I'm a historian, I looked at it entirely from a, you know, sort of this is what happened, and I tried to describe what happened. But interestingly enough, when the book came out in Germany, the reception was very positive of Lea Ypi's book, despite the fact that there's much, much more of a sort of positive tinge to that than I think there's in my book. And we spoke about it, Leah and I spoke about it on her podcast as well, and we're sort of discussing why that is and why different countries take things differently. But I think what it all boils down to is that the country that is affected by this feels threatened by that history. It's much, much easier for her and me to sit in the UK and write about Albania and East Germany respectively, because there is that distance and we can talk to British people about it because it's not their history. But then when you go back to Albania or Germany in this case, and suddenly you're talking about people's own personal history, not that long in the past, you're talking about things that they experienced themselves or that their parents or grandparents have experienced. And then suddenly, basically, there's this really deeply personal angle to that history that you wrote as a sort of bigger, you know, thing, and being further detached from it. And I think that's what sometimes makes it quite acrimonious.
Do you think that also there's an element that Germany, by which I mean West Germany, has sort of defined itself in this post-reunification period against the historical idea of the GDR? And so if you start to unpick any element of that, let's call it a fantasy, it actually has real-world implications.
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it, because obviously during the Cold War they represented two entirely different models of doing things, you know, society, culture, economics, and so on. And so basically that had to be on each side of Germany in East and in the West, that had to be defended against the other, and the other had to be deeply criticised, and you couldn't say anything positive about that. And I think that legacy has carried on, because West Germany is effectively carried on as the Federal German Republic. And so that, why would people, especially older people who are still in sort of journalism and historical studies today, they don't suddenly change their mind because the Berlin Wall falls. There's still very much an attempt to fight the GDR, to kind of combat it, to work against it. And I think what's happening now, and you could see that with some of the responses, particularly to Lea Ypi, because she is a bit more, as I say, sort of intellectual, philosophical about this, and actually criticises some of the elements of capitalism very explicitly in the book. So I think what is happening now is that we've reached this consensus, supposedly, you know, the Fukuyama's famous End of History in 1990, we've reached this consensus that the West, that capitalism, that the way that we do things is the only proper way to do things. And so when you start talking about some of the historical models that were around in the 20th century, not such a long time ago, and you mention things, as I say, like childcare or social security or whatever, there's often a sense that you're implicitly or explicitly criticising you know, the current system, the current status quo. And that's why I think a lot of people are still very sensitive about this when you mention certain things. So Germany, for instance, still to this day has got a really big problem with social mobility. People don't often know about this, but they've got a streamlined school system and basically end up having middle-class kids in university and making it very, very difficult for working class people to sort of rise out of their social background. So when you say that in the GDR there was an explicit attempt to try and get working class kids into university and into apprenticeships and into leadership positions, you can't say that without immediately being attacked. People will immediately say, but what about the people who weren't allowed to study what they wanted to study? What about the people whose families were opponents so they didn't get a place at university? All that's correct, I'm not negating that.
Right.
But to even mention the fact that there were many, many working class families who managed to basically change their social status to a more middle class one and get education and access to other things that they wouldn't have had. The moment you mention that, you're kind of seen as criticizing the West or the sort of democratic capitalist order.
Well, so let's turn a little bit to modern Germany, modern politics. I mean, you think that this view of Eastern Germany as being its own thing, its own ideas, is something that has also translated to current politics, because a lot of the support for AfD, this Alternative for Deutschland, is based in East Germany.
It is, so the figures are higher. It's about a third or so of people at the moment in the East that vote for the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD party, which is a sort of right-wing party in Germany now. But at the same time, when you look at polling for the snap election that is coming up in Germany across the country, the AfD is also the second most popular party across Germany at round about sort of 18% or so at the moment. So I think what's happening is that East Germany is in a way like the canary in the coal mine, basically. They respond more sensitively to economic crises, to political sort of stagnation than people do in the West, because they are socially in such a far more precarious position than people in the West are. And so I think that's less to do necessarily with the East-West thing, although the resentments, I think, play into that and have their role to play. Then it is a social thing, it's a class thing, I think. Because when you compare, say, East Germany to France or to Italy or to Austria, you get very, very similar results with, again, sort of a third or so of people voting for far-right populism and others voting for far-left parties. And that's, in a way, West Germany is the outlier there, in that they've stuck to the old parties far longer than many other European countries have. And I think that is partially due to the history. So when you think West Germany has had extremely positive experiences with the two main parties, the Conservatives basically were in power for most of the time and are seen as responsible for making West Germany a successful Western, very, very prosperous sort of society. And then the sort of centre-left party, the Social Democrats, are seen for liberalising the country in the late 60s and early 70s and making it more modern, socially more modern. So they both had kind of positive roles to play in the way that West Germany panned out. When you look at the East German experience since 1990, the Conservatives under Helmut Kohl promised these flowering landscapes, as Helmut Kohl put it, basically growth and economic prosperity. What happened really was, yes, a lot of people and most people are better off, but at the same time there was instability, huge rates of unemployment, and the SPD so the Social Democrats under Gerhard Schröder in the late 90s were kind of like a new Labour sort of thing. So they were actually reducing the welfare state and also, introducing kind of neoliberal policies into the workplace. So those sorts of things aren't entirely positive experiences in the way that, for working class people, in the way that the West had it. So I think that there's less of a incentive, less loyalty there, if you will, towards those parties. People are less forgiving and are more flexible politically as a result of that. And those dimensions play into it as well. But I wouldn't subscribe to the, I think, very lazy, often kind of, used in West Germany sort of narrative that East Germans are just damaged by their quote-unquote dictatorship experience, which makes them incapable of getting democracy. That's a narrative that's still out there.
They don't understand democracy just yet.
Yeah, that is still out there as a narrative and very popular because it makes the West feel better about itself, basically thinking that it's not going to get to them. But that takes that takes a very narrow view on Germany. The moment you zoom out a bit and you look at what's happening in the rest of Europe, or even in the US or in Britain, you can kind of see... It's
interesting that the kind of alternative explanation for why Angela Merkel was the Chancellor for so long could have been, the narrative could have been, you guys in West Germany screwed it up so much that it takes an East German to fix it. But they've never used that line, which I always thought was really intriguing.
No, that's because she very consciously didn't present herself as an East German, and she wasn't seen, I would say, by the majority of Germans as an East German chancellor explicitly, because she made very sure that she wasn't. So if she was blamed for stuff, it was often the specific policies that she did, but she wasn't specifically regarded as a kind of East German chancellor because she stopped talking about it so early.
We've had, when you think about modern Germany, and so Merkel, in this memoir, she identifies the defining moment of her chancellorship as 2015, when she allowed in hundreds of thousands, a million asylum seekers into Germany. And it seems to me that if you think about what modern Germany has gone through, it's gone through these two kind of big shocks, which is, one, the million asylum seekers in that period, and then now the million Ukrainians who've come since the war. That, from the outside, seems like it would define the society. I wonder if that is how you interpret modern Germany, and if you agree that Merkel's 2015 decision was as defining as she says it was.
I think it was, because it fundamentally changed German society. There's obviously the numbers that you just mentioned in themselves are huge. On top of that, though, the sort of stream of refugees also from the Middle East and from Northern Africa and from other countries hasn't really stopped. There was another huge influx in 2022, 2023, and it's estimated that it now is around sort of 3.5 million asylum seekers are registered in the country. That's on top of the people who aren't registered. So when you now go to Germany and say if you hadn't been since 2015, you will find a very, very different country. And there's no doubt that this has changed society, it's changed economics, it's changed the housing situation, all sorts of other things. And for a lot of Germans, immigration now ranks either first or second on their list of sort of political concerns that they want looked at by a new government when you look at surveys. So I would say, I would agree with her, that is the defining moment and the thing. And maybe in the long run, that and her policies towards Russia, I think, will probably be the things that will be remembered about her time in power.
We'll come to the German thing in a sec. But so, because I thought it was interesting to talk about immigration because, of course, you have this kind of dual view of it because you have the German connection, so you see about how they've interpreted taking in all these millions of people. And then also you are now based in the UK, which is also having its own conversation about immigration. Do you see that there are parallels, or are the situations kind of different? I mean, the numbers are, shockingly comparable. They were saying last week that, in the period to June of 2023, 900,000 people came into the UK, almost a million. So that there are kind of comparable numbers coming in. Do you see the debate as being similar or overlapping?
I think the debates are similar in the sense that the pressures on, society and on the economy are similar. So, say in terms of housing, there's no doubt that rents going up affect a lot of people, house prices going up, there isn't enough housing, that sort of thing I think is a very similar debate. And you also see that, for instance, in Ireland playing out as a big election issue as well. So I think those things are similar. I think where things are different is that in the UK, I think where people have concerns, they're often directed at the government because there's a feeling that the government allowed this to happen. As in, these are people that come on work visas, on study visas, they get registered, we know that they're here. I think where the situation is different in Germany is that basically since 2015 the borders have been pretty open because they are open within the EU. And the government's quite openly admitting that it hasn't really got a clue who's in the country and who isn't in the country. And that, I think, is what is the biggest concern for a lot of people, is that lack of control and the absolute abdication of any kind of desire to have any control over this that people worry about, because it's led, for instance, there was this big incident where this debate came up earlier this year where there was a stabbing in the town of Solingen where people were murdered on a sort of festival that was happening in the town of Solingen, and the man who did it was an asylum seeker who was also clearly a terrorist, and he wasn't supposed to be in the country. He was supposed to have been sent back to Bulgaria, I think, where he first sort of registered. And the fact that the government was unable, to take somebody who's in the country illegally and actually remove them, that, I think, is the biggest issue in Germany. And I think there's a slightly different dimension to that in the UK, where, yes, we have a similar debate around stop the boats and the illegal part of migration, but it's in terms of numbers, it's much, much smaller. It's basically government policy that's decided to let people into the country, mostly as labourers. Whilst in Germany, it's a very uncontrolled situation at the moment where the government isn't entirely sure who's even in the country to start with. And that, of course, raises all sorts of security problems.
Do you think the messaging in this also makes a difference? I mean, I was interested in... you notice that when the conversation happens, it's often a conversation about the people who have come in that migrant crisis period, but it's very rarely a conversation about the, whatever it is, 1.1 million Ukrainians who have come in the last 3 years. So I wonder if sometimes the messaging makes a difference to whom the public is worried about.
I think that depends which aspect of this we're talking about. So if it's about rents and about the stresses on the social welfare system, people do talk about the Ukrainians a lot as well. There's currently a debate around whether or not they should be forced to work, so whether or not they get sort of just automatic access to welfare without any sort of expectation that they will take up work eventually, or whether they should be forced into it because the welfare system is under a lot of strain. Currently, half of the costs of the welfare system goes to people without German passports. That's now getting to a situation... That's quite a big number. It's huge.
When you put it like that.
Yeah, it is a large number, and it obviously means that the people, again, working class people, your plumbers and drivers and craftsmen and people like that, when they're already struggling with inflation and all sorts of other things, housing and so on, they're not happy about that. And that debate's going on with the Ukrainians as well. On security and terrorism and things like that, yes, you have a very, very different debate. So there are a few accusations that, you know, it would be Ukrainian refugees basically, say, stabbing someone on a public square. That debate is indeed a very different one. But all of that is still happening in an incredibly charged ideological context where both sides accuse each other of sort of ideology, the left and the right, without actually sitting down and having a sensible conversation about what needs to be done. And I think that's what's fueling basically the rise of anti-immigration parties as well.
Let's talk about Ukraine and the conflict, because this is the other part of modern Germany's relationship with the outside world, which has really shifted since the Merkel years. I mean, Merkel was very keen on having close relationships with Russia. Her idea was that there was this huge country called Russia and it couldn't just be magicked away and you had to find a way to deal with it. Now, post the Ukraine invasion, that looks a little bit short-sighted. It looks like she didn't fully take the threat from Russia seriously. How does it look from within Germany? Because obviously Germany is much, much closer to the war than we are, even though they're equally involved.
Yeah, it's fascinated me since I've lived in the UK for this whole time and have obviously taken a very UK view on this, in that I fully support Ukraine. I find it very difficult to find any way of justifying the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, but lots and lots of Germans see it very differently. It's a much, much more controversial topic in Germany that divides the country, particularly in the east. There's a lot of fear regarding Russia, so the sense that, you know, that this old cliche of don't poke the Russian bear sort of thing is still very much around. If you talk about weapons deliveries to Ukraine and so on, people will tell you that, you know, they quote Napoleon at you. They sort of go, you know, in 1812 he tried to invade Russia and he didn't manage. Hitler found out the same thing. People go back that far and they basically try and justify that way why Russia should be appeased rather than challenged. And that's how many people in Germany see the war. I think that's partially to do with the fact, as you say, that the country's a lot closer and that there's maybe more fear involved as a result of that. I think it's also Germany's history at the sort of fault lines of the Cold War. You know, the fact that there were nuclear weapons stationed on both sides, and there was always a sense that if the Cold War escalated, Germany would be turned into a wasteland first. That, I think, is still very much around, particularly when Putin actually threatens to use nuclear weapons. There are far more people in Britain, I would say, who don't take it seriously when he says these things, compared to Germany, where it creates real fear. And I think the last dimension of that is that, especially in the East, but also in the more left-wing elements in the West, there's a sense that Russia is the anti-Western option, basically. So if you are anti-Western, anti-American, if you feel that NATO is an aggressive imperialist enterprise, as Olaf Scholz once called it when he was younger and more radical, then you have this natural instinct towards seeing this as an act of sort of NATO incursion into Eastern Europe, into areas where they have no business being, and then you explain the war away that way as Russia defending itself.
Yeah, I'm slightly surprised. I mean, you do seem to be taking a very kind of British view, because I think I do wonder sometimes if the British and American view is formed really by distance from the war, because it is a real hot burning war, and when you are in Germany or you are somewhere on the European continent, it's right there. I mean, the distance from Berlin to Russian territory like Kaliningrad is not very far. So it doesn't feel like it's some sort of theoretical war where we have to defend freedom forever. It feels like, oh, it's an actual war where there are soldiers and there are missiles, and those missiles might find their way to us.
That's true, but I was also quite shocked to find that when Russia stationed missiles in Kaliningrad, I think it was in 2012, basically putting them in range of Berlin, there was no outrage about that. Not in the public. There's no sense of why are they doing this. Yes, it was discussed briefly in the news, but it wasn't something that people felt particularly threatened by, and yet they're happy to turn this whole picture around and agree that Russia has a right to feel threatened if Ukraine is turning westward. So I find the psychology of this quite interesting, and I do think this has a lot to do with politics as much as geography, really, in the sense that people are looking towards Russia, particularly the sort of populist end of the spectrum, are looking towards Russia as a sort of anti-woke, anti-Western, anti-liberal option as well. I think that's also got a lot to do with that.
I want to end by talking a little bit about the personality of Merkel. We were talking before the recording about this interview that she has just given with Barack Obama in the US about promoting this new book. And we were saying that it's interesting, of course, that the US president that she is interviewed by is Barack Obama. And we all remember that famous photograph of her where it looked like she was handing over leadership of the free world to Obama. And I wonder if you feel, as I do, that there's this curious idea of those two particular politicians in the Western liberal mind, that they somehow represent a period of time when things were going great. Like there was a person in Europe who knew what she was doing, and then there was this person in America who was a serious liberal politician, and they feel that things have gone off the rails since then.
I mean, that is certainly the image that a lot of people have of both of them. Angela Merkel was famously always called the leader of the free world by the sort of liberal press, especially after Trump came into power in 2016. She seemed the sort of antidote to that brand of politics. And the same is true for Barack Obama. There are many people who are quite nostalgic, and there we have that word again, this sort of idealized version of what was going on then. But both of them were in power at times that were a lot less crisis-driven. This was pre-COVID, this was pre the war in Ukraine, pre-inflation. Things were going okay then, and both of them, I would say, managed that status quo rather than thinking ahead and really making some bold decisions at a time when that would have been possible. So I think maybe there's a bit of a conflation of the sort of times that they lived in and that they ran politics in, and their actual leadership qualities. I think they're both now seen as sort of sensible, pragmatic politicians, but that was okay at a time where no huge decisions had to be made. Both of them could also, in hindsight, be accused of kicking the can down the road, of not making decisions that needed to be made. Angela Merkel was quite happy to carry on basically with Germany's intertwining with Russia on energy, on making itself completely dependent on it. Barack Obama famously spoke of red lines in the sand that he then didn't follow up in the Middle Eastern conflict. And those sorts of things you can turn the sort of idea of stability around and really look at it as a period of political stagnation as well.
I'm trying to get you to say that the liberals are engaging in their own version of Ostalgie.
Yeah, I think there's certainly parallels there. I mean, in Germany, I see a lot of people have now come up with this term of Westalgie, the sort of nostalgia for the old West German Republic, for when things were still okay in the 50s and 60s, and then somehow reunification ruined it. So
right.
There's that element there as well. Maybe that applies also to some extent to the sort of 2000s and the sort of time before 2016, and then again before 2022.
About Merkel particularly, because I think something that people are often very interested in is how she dealt with some of these more antagonistic world leaders. There is a particular anecdote about Putin and his dog, which I think is worth hearing. Do you want to tell that story?
Yeah, so I think the more well-known aspect of this is that Angela Merkel and Putin met, and she'd asked him not to bring his dog, Coney, who's a black Labrador, along, which she sometimes does, basically just brings the dog along, because she's frightened of dogs. She was bitten by one once and has basically had a phobia of dogs since, and so she asked him explicitly not to bring Coney along, and he did. And there's this famous picture of her and Putin sitting in their chairs, and the Labrador is sitting in front of them, and Putin is grinning and rubbing his hands. And Angela Merkel looks slightly apprehensive and had to sort of grin and bear it, as she put it. But in the book, she reveals another episode where a year earlier he'd brought a sort of stuffed toy dog along and told her that it wouldn't bite. And then her I forget who it was, her fellow politician who was with her at the time, had to carry this huge dog around with them all day until an aide took it off them.
Oh, it was a very large stuffed dog.
Yeah, huge,
Right.
Apparently. And she sort of tells that in the book to show what he was like as a person, and how she felt humiliated but had to sort of deal with it at the time in view of the sort of greater good.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that you also see it with other world leaders. For example, with Trump in the first term, where he refused to shake her hand in front of the media, and again there, I mean, she looked kind of humiliated by it. How do these things play out in Germany, and do you think there's a gendered aspect to it as well?
I mean, she, during her time in office, like the East German thing, she also never tried to make a big deal out of being a woman. She didn't want to be a female chancellor. She didn't want to be an East German chancellor. She just wanted to be the chancellor of all Germans. And so she would have never come out and said at the time, this is very much a thing of how women are treated. But there are lots of incidences in her book where she does feel looked down upon, specifically as a woman. So she says, for example, that they were, in the early years in particular, because the West German political establishment was still like ultra conservative and very, very stuffy in its own way, and so all the women ministers were given what was seen as sort of social issues to deal with, like family and youth and those sorts of things, and they weren't really trusted with the hard politics really of foreign policy.
That was her first
and so
portfolio.
Yeah, indeed, being the minister for sort of women and youth, and then she kind of says also some of the meetings, the way that she was treated in them. And with Putin, there's no doubt in my mind that he doesn't take female leaders as seriously as he does male ones. And that certainly could have been an aspect of it. But it's also just a generic challenge, isn't it, to sort of Western leaders in the way that the Soviets did it throughout the Cold War, testing somebody's character, testing their resolve, testing their strength, and doing it on a very personal level. Whilst I think
very Putin way of doing things, actually.
Yeah, well, and generally I would say even a Russian way of doing things as well. I mean, when you look at how Kennedy, for instance, was treated at the time, it's a similar sort of, he's a young new president, he had to be tested. So the Cuban Missile Crisis in lots of ways is a test of his personal character. But in the West, we think of institutions, we think almost like it doesn't matter who the chancellor is or who the leader or the prime minister or the president is. They are an institution in and of themselves, whilst I think there's still, certainly in Putin's mind, very much a case of you deal with people, with individual people, and you kind of do it on a very chauvinistic, old school way.
Yeah, I mean, Merkel, as you say, she writes in the book that she didn't want to be defined as part of a group. And at the end, she comes around to this and says, well, I'm a feminist in my way. I was talking to a colleague about this morning, and it seems interesting to us that there was a period of time where two of the most powerful countries in Europe, Britain and Germany, probably the two most powerful, sorry, France, but the two most powerful countries in Europe had female leaders at the exact same time, Theresa May in Britain and Angela Merkel in Germany, and yet it was barely remarked upon. It wasn't something that either of them made a big part of their political personality. I wonder if you think that was a mistake, or was it something that they did because it suited their political purposes, or is it something that just perhaps no longer matters?
I don't think it is a mistake. I mean, in lots of ways, we've gone back on these issues, haven't we, in current day identity politics. There was a time where it was seen as an ideal not to think about gender or skin colour or creed or whatever anymore. You basically thought of people as people and took them on their own merits. And I think in a way now making this a defining part of your personality is something that's come back to us, I would say, in recent years. And you can't really say to somebody in 2010, or whatever, that they should have explicitly made a point of being a female or having whatever kind of identity really as their background when people elected them. I think not because they were female, but because they were, the candidate at the time that got the most votes. So I think also there's a desire, I would say, both with Theresa May and with Angela Merkel as well, to just being taken seriously, basically as the politicians that they were, and therefore not playing a certain sort of identity card and saying I should be treated differently because I'm this, that, and the other. They wanted the opposite, I think, both of them, and I find it very difficult now in hindsight to look at this interview that Angela Merkel, or the panel discussion that Angela Merkel was on when she was asked explicitly, are you a feminist? And she was sort of umming and ahhing about it.
Bit.
Yeah. I think, I find it really odd that other people are telling her how she should have felt about that or what she should have done with that, because it is very much looking back now, I think, with our current day identity politics hat on, and finding it difficult that at the time she may just not have perceived herself as that.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, actually, as it pertains to Germany, it's about identity politics, was about your view of Britain and Germany in terms of the racial aspect of politics. I was very interested earlier this year when Karamba Diaby, who is the first African-born member of parliament in Germany, decided not to run because of the death threats he received. And it kind of emphasized what I think is a difference, and I'm interested to see if you think there's a difference, in the way that race in politics plays out in Britain versus Germany. It seems to me that it is more of an issue in Germany, whereas here, I mean, we've had people of colour running the country as Prime Minister, people of colour as, in all the main political positions.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, it's not often, because of the politics that we've had and because of the public mood, I don't think it's often praised about Britain, but I think it should be, that it plays much less of a role here than it does in Germany, those sorts of things. I think even with Theresa May, people were of course saying, that she's a female prime minister and so on, but both that and the racial aspect of people's background or their identity isn't in the foreground as much as it is in Germany, where it's absolutely still perceived as something at the very least special or different about you, but it's certainly part of the way that you're seen, both positively and negatively, if you do have a different skin colour or you come from a different background. People often accuse people, of just being the sort of quota minority or of only being in their position because of their skin colour. That's still a thing in Germany as well.
I mean, we had a situation where you had a Prime Minister whose heritage is from a part of the world that the British had colonised in India, Rishi Sunak. Can you imagine a scenario where a German Chancellor comes from like a former colony, Tanzania or something like this?
Yeah, I think the situation there is a bit different because Germany obviously had a much smaller empire and also had it for a much shorter time because they had to give it up after the First World War. And so I don't think empire is as much part of the German psyche, of the German backlog, in the way, for lack of a better word, as it is in Britain, where it's still very much part of the nation's conscious memory, I would say. So I don't think that's so much the issue. I don't think people would even know specifically which African countries were part of the German Empire. I think it's more a question of somebody coming from an ethnically different background, regardless of what that is, if they're a visible minority, basically. Maybe the better comparison would be Turkey, since so many Turkish people came to Germany, West Germany, after the Second World War as guest workers, was the phrase that people used, because they were supposed to kind of just come in and work and go back. Yeah. And so if you had, say, a Turkish chancellor, that would be a big deal in Germany. It really would, I think, in a way that it isn't clearly in Britain anymore.
Okay, so final question then. So we've talked about that. You've written this book about East Germany. You've written more recently about the defining period of this post-war reconciliation. How do you think this most recent period of German history will be remembered?
It's a really difficult question because I think it will depend a little bit on how politicians now deal with the fallout from this. But I thought about this long and hard myself when I was reading Angela Merkel's biography, and I thought she was in power for 16 years, and I found it very difficult to pin down the one thing that she stood for. You know, most of the other West German chancellors certainly had that. So Helmut Kohl was like the reunification chancellor, that was like his big project. Or you had Konrad Adenauer, the first West German chancellor, who decided that West Germany was a Western country, and that's not an easy thing to say for Germany, sitting in the sort of middle and looking east and west, and he just decided, regardless of the damage it did to the prospect of reunification, that the main thing was for West Germany to be Western orientated and to look towards America rather than Russia. So they all had their one thing, and I don't think Angela Merkel has that, and certainly the current coalition doesn't have that, because they were so internally divided from the beginning and have now collapsed. It's hard to kind of point to anything really that they would have been remembered by. So in a way it's a sort of period I would probably title with the decisive meh. nothing much happened, and the status quo was kind of managed, and I think maybe she'll be seen, despite the long period she was in power, maybe as an interim chancellor to something else that may well still come in the future.
The headline writers would call it the Merkel years.
Yeah, good one. Couldn't think of that myself.
Katja Hoyer, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines Magazine. You can find Katja Hoyer on Twitter @Hoyer_KAT. Her book, Beyond the Wall, is available now online and in all good bookstores. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.